At this point in professional learning, central office table monitors would have come to you and dropped off your data, your whole class and grade level data from the number knowledge test. So we want you to give you 5 minutes to fill your data out. Personally, as a team, we want you to reflect on what you may be thinking and feeling as you look at your grade levels data. You can be quiet, you can discuss, you can have emotion. Do whatever that is that you feel like you need to do before we begin problem solving. And please, please remember, data is not a reflection of who the teacher is as a person, but a reflection of what's happening in the classroom. So please pause if needed to reflect and have feelings and emotion about your data. And carry on the presentation when you're ready. So we aren't going to have time in today's professional learning to walk you through the best practices of the TIPS model because it's a very lengthy process. But we'll do what we can in a format that gets you to the point of leaving today with a plan for your next steps after reviewing and problem solving your data. So, we want to have you create basically your triangle to see where your proficiency levels come out. And if you would, use your chart paper to write out, according to your data and your printout, what percentage of students fell into the green, yellow, and red areas, as well as how many children that was in each tier. Off to the side, write the total number of students that you had in your grade level. You may wish to write your school's name on the top. So please pause the presentation. You may work through this handout if needed, the determining effectiveness of core instruction data, whatever you need to do to get your chart completed. So as you complete your data and have your charts available, are you happy with the data for all of your students? And would you put your own flesh and blood in every classroom? Again, remember, you typically won't get 100% yes to both these questions, but we need to bring our best self to the table and have problem-solving discussions because the work of MTSS and problem-solving data is really hard and messy work. When reviewing our data as a district, we did the same thing we just asked you to do, and this is how our data fell out. We had 107 schools, 11,193 students, and we did get that 83.5 proficiency. Remember, our goal is 75 to 80 in core, so that's good. In the yellow, we would be expecting that what? 15%, right? We got lower than that. That's interesting. But then, in that red part of the triangle, the intensive range, we overshot that 5%, right? So it looks like we need to think about what these percentages mean in terms of meeting core with 83.5, but then exceeding the intensive range. So the first thing that we always do when we use the TIPS model is we collect and use data, which is what you got from your number knowledge test beginning of the year assessment results. The next thing is that we want to identify the problems. So Albert Einstein said this: if I had 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 minutes solving it. What we want to take away from this is that by making sure that we define the problem explicitly and specifically, we're able to strategically match appropriate solutions. So, whenever we're identifying and defining the problem, we need to think about some guiding questions. So what's the difference between the expected level and current level of performance? So we talked about earlier, our expected level of proficiency with core is 80%. So did we get 80% or did we not? What's that gap? What's that difference? Kind of like what I just mentioned with our red area, our intensive area from the district. It was 9.8. Our expected level was 5. So that gap is in the opposite direction of what we would want it to be. And then are there subgroups for which the identified problem is more or less significant? So we might have schools that have 80%, but when we look at subgroup data, like students with disabilities, students with other risk factors, we might find that 80% of those subgroups are not proficient. And then we want to write a problem statement that talks about questions that can be answered with data. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we can better define the problem. It's very important for us to remember that no matter what school that we work at, whether we call ourselves high performing or low performing, we all have problems. The way that we solve them is what makes us different. So here are some examples of models of problem statements, right, for different types of schools. So the first bullet point talks about Brick Road Elementary. So their focus was that 65% were proficient with skills on the number knowledge test, and 30% were approaching non-proficiency. That just means that non-proficiency would be like kids in the yellow, right? And then the 5% were the kids in the red. So their problem statement reads that way. For Golden Road Elementary, they had 98% of students meeting proficiency, but only 15% of Hispanic students met the cut score. So for them, they had more of a subgroup issue, right? They over exceeded their core proficiency at 98, which was 18% above what best practice would be, but the subgroup of Hispanic students was not meeting the expectation. For Platinum Road, wow, they had 99% of their students meeting proficiency, but then what they had to do is when they broke down their data and found their problem, what they realized was their problems were kind of itemized. So 50% of their students missed a certain item on the number knowledge test. If we were to write a problem statement for the district, it might look something like this. Please take a moment to read the problem statement. So what we would like you to do now is meet with your table group and your grade level to write out your problem statement for your school's data. Please pause the presentation during this time to complete this task. As we revisit the TIPS model, we've collected and used data, we've identified our problem, now we need to develop our hypothesis. I'm not going to go too much into this, but just to put it on your radar and help you think through these lenses, we use a process called ISO by Riot. It involves instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner considerations. Instruction is how the curriculum is taught, curriculum is what is taught, environment is where it's taught, and learner is who is taught. We review information by determining whether or not we need more data, or we found enough data to validate or invalidate our hypothesis. The same stands true for interviews, observing, and test. We don't have to review, interview, observe, and test for every problem or every area of instruction or every area for curriculum. When we review and we find out what the problem is, we're done. We look at whether or not our hypothesis is validated or invalidated, we move on. We may need to do a review and an interview, but we don't necessarily have to do review, interview, observe, and test for every hypothesis. We mentioned this earlier, that instruction is how the curriculum is taught. Curriculum is what is taught. The environment is where the instruction takes place, and the learner is who is being taught. So you heard me mention earlier that we use lenses to determine what types of things that we consider when we're problem solving. A key point to remember is that ICE, instruction, curriculum, environment, is what is impacting the learner. We want to spend our time and energy in this phase because ICE, instruction, curriculum, and environment, is what you can control. The problem occurs when we put the learner first and we get lice, right? When we have lice happening in the problem-solving process, we don't always consider the things that we have in our control, which is instruction, curriculum, environment, and we often blame the learner. What is under our least control is the learner. So when we think about an example of this, here was a student that I used to work with who was in kindergarten, and he was probably a good example of lice. He really struggled behaviorally, and he comes from a family from another cultural background, and they also had many children in the family, no previous daycare or schooling. And I learned about him because I would hear him kind of in the admin wing where he was at a point of receiving consequences or getting in trouble, if you will. And I was asked to support some interventions and find ways to keep him in the classroom. And when I got to observe the child in the classroom, I started to wonder when instruction was occurring and what part of the curriculum was actually being taught due to the environment, because the classroom management skills were poor and it was difficult for instruction and curriculum to be delivered under that type of environment in the classroom. And I began to see that maybe this particular student that I was there to intervene for wasn't the only one that was doing flips across the tables, climbing on furniture, throwing things, hitting or hurting other children, being out of his seat. There were several other children in the classroom behaving in the same way. So what I began to notice is this child had a Tier 3 or FBA BIP type plan. We didn't maybe consider the instruction, curriculum, and environment before we went straight to the learner. This is a good example of lice, and thinking that probably the best thing that we could have done in that situation is address the things that we had the most control over, which were the instruction, curriculum, and environment. An interesting point about this student in question that we just talked about as the example is he went on to first grade and he no longer needed a plan, and he responded to the instruction, curriculum, and environment and almost appeared to be a different student. So just like we modeled our problem statement, here's some model hypotheses. We revisit Brick Road Elementary. They had 65% of their students proficient with the skills on the number knowledge test. And they had 30% of their students on the cusp, of like that yellow range. And then they have 5% that were not yet proficient. Their hypothesis were that maybe students were pulled out of class during math block or core instruction. So they were wondering, of those 30% and or 5%, were those children that scored at that level being pulled out of class, so they weren't able to receive core instruction. Golden Road Elementary had 98% of their students meeting core, and 15% of that subgroup for the Hispanic students were of concern. Their hypothesis was that their math block was at the start of the school day, and many of the Hispanic students were tardy, and they may have missed math instruction. Platinum Road had 99% of students meeting proficiency on the NKT, but 50% of their students missed item 1 on level 1 of the NKT. They felt like their team used reteaching of daily math routines during the intervention block for that first week of school. Then they realized they switched their intervention block to focus on literacy. So they're wondering if somehow what they could have done for an enrichment was impacted by switching from math to a literacy focus. Before you write your hypothesis, please remember to consider instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner last, considering ICE mainly, what we can control. Remember, your students had 30 days of instruction prior to being assessed. So try to limit the hypothesis of the reasoning being lack of exposure, prior knowledge, or preschool. Make sure your hypothesis falls under instruction, curriculum, environment. So as you write your hypothesis, we're going to follow a protocol. So in just a moment, I'm going to unveil the protocol that we're going to follow. And protocols are used to make sure that all voices are heard and all people get equitable voice in the decisions or the solutions or the dialogue that's being had. So, if you're working in your teams, please follow these processes. Pause the presentation as needed so that all can participate. For question number 3, or item number 3, what everyone usually asks about this is they don't really get this part. So if you write a hypothesis on a Post-it note, the person with the most blue on would take everybody's Post-it note, and on the top one they would write A. On the one under that they'll write B. On the one under that they'll write C. They'll write D, E, F, as many letters as they need to go in the alphabet until all the people's hypotheses on each Post-it note are accounted for. Then the hypotheses or the Post-it notes are laid out on the table so everyone can view them, and each person will vote on the lettered hypothesis that they think is the main cause of their identified problem. So if we have A through Q laid out on the table, I might pick the Post-it note that has a D on it, and I'm going to say my vote, the main cause of our identified problem is letter D. And everyone around the table shares their vote. The person with the fanciest shoes will ask each person to share their vote, as I just mentioned, and the hypothesis with the most energy will be written on your worksheet, which you have as a handout in your chart, your big chart with your triangle on it. So to model, our hypothesis for Wake County District data was seen here. Please take a moment to review it. Again, let's revisit what it means to adjust core. Remember, we're not changing the content, but we're changing the approach to the content. When you review your data, work through the guiding questions in ISO by Riot, and look at these questions, these guiding questions, and what answers you have in terms of how you could adjust core instruction to meet the needs of all students. You can use your ISO by Riot matrix that you have as a handout that's been specifically created for you based on a day's learning. It looks at the implementation of the new components of the daily routines of math instruction and how you align your results to the number knowledge test. You can use this document to support problem solving and determining whether or not your hypothesis is validated. You will now review Riot as much as possible in this kind of controlled condition of our professional learning, and you may find that some of your hypotheses are explicitly embedded in this handout or within your guided questions. So at this point, we've collected and used data, identified problems, developed our hypothesis, and now we will discuss and select solutions. Please take time with your grade level team to discuss and select solutions based on your identified hypothesis.